Ladies and gentlemen, today we look back at a list of deaths so brutal, so terrifying, so deeply embedded in the bones of early American history, that most of us, sitting comfortably in modern safety, would not have survived a day. To understand why survival was such a struggle on the American frontier, you have to grasp just how hostile and volatile the environment truly was. This wasn't just untamed land. It was a constantly shifting battlefield between man and nature, often indifferent to human life. One day you could be riding under clear skies, and the next, a blizzard could sweep in from nowhere, blanketing the land and freezing everything in its path. Weather systems were brutal and often unforecasted, turning what should have been a simple journey into a deadly test of endurance. The terrain itself was unforgiving. From jagged mountain passes to endless deserts, vast forests to swamp-infested lowlands, the land was never kind to travelers. Rivers with strong, deceptive currents could sweep away entire wagons. Rocky trails could snap ankles, break wheels, and leave you stranded with no aid in sight. Getting lost wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. And let's not forget the human threat. The frontier was lawless for long stretches, with few established systems of justice. Robbers, claim jumpers, and desperate men roamed freely. Treaties were broken, boundaries were unclear, and tensions between settlers, Native American tribes, and rival explorers often erupted into violence. At any moment, a seemingly peaceful camp could turn into the site of an ambush or skirmish. You couldn't afford to let your guard down, not for 1 second. Even food and water, which we often take for granted, were unreliable. Streams might be contaminated. Game might vanish for weeks. A single mistake, drinking from a bad source, hunting in the wrong place, trusting the wrong stranger, could spell your end. The American frontier didn't play favorites. It didn't care if you were rich or poor, brave or smart, man or woman. It tested everyone. It broke many. And those it didn't kill still carried the scars, physical, mental, and spiritual. On the American frontier, death came in many forms, sudden, slow, violent, or invisible. It didn't matter who you were or how strong you thought yourself to be. The odds were stacked against you from the moment you stepped onto untamed land. Nature was one of the deadliest killers. Extreme cold could seep into your bones, freezing you to death overnight while you slept in a canvas tent or under a brittle roof. Intense heat could dry out your body and crack your lips, leaving you hallucinating in the middle of a desert trail. Rainstorms could flood camps in minutes, washing away livestock, supplies, and even children. Lightning struck open plains without warning, and tornadoes ripped through the land with brutal force, leaving nothing behind but shattered wood and silence. Then there were wild animals, lurking in the shadows of every forest and mountain range. A grizzly bear attack wasn't just fatal, it was horrific. One swipe of a paw could tear flesh from bone, and if you didn't die instantly, you'd likely bleed out in agony. Wolves hunted in packs, circling travelers and waiting for weakness. Mountain lions stalked silently and struck from above. Even smaller creatures like rattlesnakes, scorpions, and spiders carried venom that could kill within hours, or cause days of unrelenting pain before death. Disease was another merciless force. With no real medical infrastructure in place, frontier settlers were incredibly vulnerable to outbreaks. Cholera could sweep through a wagon train in days, dehydrating victims until they died curled up on the trail. Dysentery was common and could turn a simple stomach ache into a fatal condition. Smallpox outbreaks decimated entire settlements. And infections from minor injuries, a scraped knee, a splinter, a rusty nail, could quickly spiral into sepsis without proper treatment. There were no antibiotics, no sterile tools, and in many cases, no doctors within hundreds of miles. And if nature and illness didn't get you, violence often did. The frontier was riddled with territorial disputes, clashes over resources, and racial and cultural tensions that erupted into bloodshed. Settlers fought with Native American tribes, often over stolen land, broken promises, or desperate survival. Bandits patrolled remote roads, robbing and killing without remorse. Even within settlements, arguments over land claims or stolen cattle could end in gunfire. Justice was often doled out with a bullet, and many men died not in battle, but in drunken saloon fights, ambushes, or back-alley stabbings. The frontier wasn't just a place where death was common. It was a place where how you died often told a brutal story, a story of risk, recklessness, resilience, and the sheer unpredictability of trying to carve out a life on the edge of civilization. We often romanticize frontier life as a test of sheer toughness, the image of the rugged cowboy or hardened pioneer pushing through adversity with grit alone. But the brutal truth is, toughness wasn't enough. It didn't matter how strong your body was or how hard your will. If you didn't have the skills, the knowledge, and a bit of luck, the frontier would chew you up and spit you out. Survival out, there was a delicate balancing act between preparation and unpredictability. You had to know how to hunt, trap, build shelter, start a fire without matches, and treat wounds with whatever you had on hand, because the nearest town might be 100 miles away and no one was coming to help. You needed to identify edible plants and avoid poisonous ones, purify water with charcoal and cloth, and sew your own clothes or shoes when they fell apart. Every basic task we take for granted today required experience and resourcefulness just to avoid disaster. Then there were the mental and emotional challenges. Resilience wasn't just a virtue, it was a survival tool. You had to keep going when your child died of fever, when your crops failed, when wolves took your livestock, or when your only companion vanished and left you to face the wilderness alone. You had to be able to suffer, mourn, adapt, and still wake up the next day and push forward. Many people simply couldn't. Some went mad. Some gave up. Some laid down in the dirt and never got back up. And even if you had the skills and the spirit, you still needed luck, a force that was completely out of your control. A sudden storm could destroy months of planning. A bullet could miss or hit depending on a gust of wind. Disease didn't care if you were strong or smart. You could do everything right and still die from a misstep on a ridge or a bad batch of water. The frontier didn't reward toughness. It rewarded those who could think, adapt, and endure. It favored people who were clever enough to read the land, brave enough to trust their instincts, and fortunate enough to avoid being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was survival of the fittest, yes, but also the smartest, the calmest under pressure, and sometimes just the luckiest. On the American frontier, death didn't always arrive in some grand, cinematic fashion. More often than not, it came from tiny, almost laughably simple miscalculations, the kind we'd never think twice about today. But out there, even the smallest error could unravel everything. Take, for example, the choice of a campsite. Pick the wrong spot, too close to a river, under a weakened tree, or on low ground before a storm, and you could find yourself drowning in a flash flood or crushed in your sleep. Build your fire too close to your shelter, and the whole thing might go up in flames overnight, trapping everyone inside. Leave your boots outside, and scorpions or snakes might crawl in. Forget to tether your horse, and you might wake up alone and stranded, your only means of travel gone. Even misjudging the weather could be fatal. A settler might think they had time to cross a mountain pass before snowfall, only to be buried alive by a sudden blizzard. Or they might assume they could reach the next water source before running dry, not realizing how fast the desert heat could dehydrate them. People died not just from extreme events, but from underestimating them. Food preservation was another common pitfall. Spoiled meat might not smell off, especially in the cold, but eat it, and you could fall violently ill. Settlers who didn't know how to properly salt, smoke, or store their food risked starvation or food poisoning in places where doctors didn't exist and medicines were improvised from bark and roots. Navigation errors were also tragically frequent. Trails weren't always marked. Maps were vague or wrong. Getting lost could mean wandering for days without water or walking straight into hostile territory. And once you were lost, panic often set in, causing people to make rushed, desperate decisions that only worsened their situation. What made these mistakes so deadly wasn't always the mistake itself. It was the isolation. There were no phones, no GPS, no hospitals. Help was rarely more than a fantasy. If you made a bad call, you had to deal with the consequences alone, with what you had in your hands and mind. One slip of judgment could start a domino effect that ended with a shallow grave on the side of a trail, marked only by a pile of stones or a wooden cross. These weren't just accidents. They were lessons paid for in blood, stark reminders that the margin for error in frontier life was razor thin, and that even the most innocent choices could lead to the most brutal consequences. On the American frontier, the line between life and death was terrifyingly thin, and not just for individuals, but for entire families. One moment, a cabin might be filled with the sound of children playing, a fire crackling in the hearth, and the smell of stew hanging in the air. By morning, that same home could be reduced to silence, smoke, or nothing at all. The frontier was a place where whole households disappeared as if swallowed by the earth itself. Brutal weather was often the culprit. Blizzards in the North and Midwest could entomb homes in snow within hours. If a family didn't have enough wood, or if their chimney collapsed, they could freeze to death just feet from warmth. Spring floods were equally unforgiving, swollen rivers sweeping away homes, livestock, wagons, and people in the blink of an eye. Thunderstorms could unleash lightning that ignited fires in dry grasslands, trapping families inside flaming cabins with no way to escape. Then there were the raids and reprisals, born from the deep tensions between native tribes and white settlers. These events were often fueled by broken treaties, stolen land, and brutal acts committed by both sides. A family homestead could be seen as a threat or a provocation, and under the cover of night, it might be raided, sometimes as a warning, sometimes out of desperation. Retaliation was swift and often indiscriminate, and those caught in the middle, families trying to build a quiet life, frequently paid the price with their lives. Some were never found. Others were discovered days later, their homes burned to ashes. But even without war or weather, the wilderness itself could devour entire families. A father could venture out to hunt and never return, leaving his wife and children vulnerable. Food could run out, and starvation might set in silently, tragically. Disease could sweep through a household in days, especially if it was isolated, leaving no survivors and no one to even bury the dead. Sometimes, travelers would come across a home with the doors swinging open, food rotting on the table, and not a single soul inside. No one ever knew exactly what happened. And perhaps most haunting of all were the disappearances with no clear explanation. A family would be there one day, waving to a passing traveler, mending fences, tending crops, and by the next week, nothing remained but a few scattered belongings. No signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away, just eerie quiet where life once was. These stories were not just rare tragedies. They were part of the collective memory of the frontier. Cautionary tales passed from one settler to the next, spoken in hushed tones around campfires or written in fading ink in old letters. They were reminders that no one, no matter how well prepared or tight-knit, was truly safe. Not from nature, not from conflict, and not from the invisible dangers that crept in with the wind and vanished just as quickly. On the frontier, death didn't always wear the face of a grizzly bear or a bandit with a rifle. More often, it crept in quietly, unseen and unstoppable. Disease was the deadliest killer of all, far more lethal than any gunfight or accident. It didn't matter how brave you were, how many rifles you had, or how strong your body seemed. Once sickness set in, survival became a roll of the dice. Settlers lived in close quarters, cramped cabins with poor ventilation, dirty hands handling food, water drawn from streams shared with animals. There were no proper sanitation systems. Human waste was often dumped too close to wells or allowed to seep into the ground. This created the perfect breeding ground for deadly bacteria. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever tore through settlements, sometimes wiping out dozens in just days. The worst part? Nobody really understood why it was happening. Germ theory was still not widely accepted, and most frontier doctors, if there was a doctor at all, relied on outdated methods. They'd treat fevers with bloodletting or purgatives that did more harm than good. Some illnesses were met with superstitions instead of science. Garlic tied around the neck, whiskey as a cure-all, or burning herbs to cleanse the air. People tried everything because they were desperate, and most of the time, it didn't work. Childhood diseases hit especially hard. Measles, mumps, scarlet fever, whooping cough, all ran rampant through communities with no vaccines, no antibiotics, no effective treatments. A single outbreak could turn a cabin into a house of mourning overnight. Mothers would watch helplessly as one child after another fell ill, burning up with fever or choking from fluid in the lungs. Sometimes they had to dig the graves themselves. Tuberculosis, known then as consumption, was another silent terror. It could linger in a family for months or years, slowly draining the life from its victims while others stood by, unable to do anything but wait and pray. Malaria haunted the swamps and river regions, and smallpox outbreaks could devastate entire towns, especially in isolated areas where no one had immunity. Even minor injuries were dangerous. A splinter that became infected, a toothache that turned into an abscess, a cut that festered. Without antiseptics, without sterile instruments, these simple wounds could spiral into gangrene or sepsis. Amputation was often the only option, and it was performed with saws, no anesthesia, and only the strongest whiskey to dull the agony. And worst of all, death from disease was often slow. Settlers had to watch their loved ones waste away, helpless to stop it. A mother cradling her feverish baby, a husband holding the hand of his coughing wife. These were the quiet, brutal scenes that played out day after day. And because travel was slow and dangerous, most people died without ever seeing a doctor, relying instead on homemade remedies passed down through generations or scribbled in the margins of a family Bible. Sickness didn't respect borders, age, or strength. It haunted the frontier like a ghost, always there, always waiting. Life on the American frontier was filled with constant physical labor, danger, and unpredictability. It wasn't a question of if an accident would happen. It was only a matter of when and how bad it would be. Settlers didn't have the luxury of safety gear, emergency services, or even the most basic medical supplies. Every day brought a fresh risk, and a single misstep could mean death. Imagine trying to build your own home with nothing but an axe, a saw, and your bare hands. Trees had to be felled and shaped into logs. A misjudged swing of the axe could sever a finger, a foot, or worse. A falling tree could crush a man instantly, leaving his family stranded without their provider. Roofs were high and slippery. A slip from just 10 feet up could break your back, and with no doctors or painkillers, you'd be left in agony, paralyzed or slowly dying from internal injuries. Even something as basic as lighting a fire could end in disaster. Cabin fires were horrifyingly common. If a spark landed on a dry thatched roof, flames could spread in seconds. Families might lose everything: their shelter, their food stores, their lives, all because of one unattended ember. Burns were not only excruciating, but also often fatal due to infection. Transportation was another constant threat. Wagons could tip over on rocky trails, pinning or crushing people underneath. Horses spooked easily. A sudden noise could cause them to bolt, dragging someone behind or trampling anyone in their path. Crossing rivers posed immense risk, especially with strong currents, unstable banks, or crumbling makeshift bridges. People drowned routinely, caught beneath overturned wagons, or swept away in icy waters. And then there was the land itself, wild, unforgiving, and unpredictable. Settlers could fall into hidden sinkholes or deep ravines. A simple hike could turn deadly if someone slipped on loose gravel, broke a leg, and was unable to make it back. There were no cell phones, no helicopters, no search and rescue teams. If you were injured in the middle of nowhere, your only hope was that someone would find you, and often they didn't. Farming, too, was a minefield of danger. Heavy plows, sharp tools, and large animals made for a brutal combination. Getting kicked by a mule, trampled by cattle, or caught in a collapsing barn was all too common. And if you lost a hand or a limb, your working days were likely over. That often meant the difference between surviving the winter or not. The worst part? These accidents didn't just harm the individual. They threatened entire families. If a father was crippled or killed, the mother and children were left with overwhelming responsibilities they might not have the strength or numbers to manage. An accident could throw an entire household into survival mode, where even small tasks became life or death struggles. On the frontier, there were no guarantees. Every chore, every trip, every job carried risk. There was no room for hesitation, but there was also no safety net. And when the worst happened, when someone slipped, was crushed, burned, or thrown, there was almost never a second chance. In the vast stretches of the American frontier, isolation wasn't just a condition, it was a force. A slow, creeping presence that settled over a person like a shadow they couldn't shake. For many settlers, especially those who pushed westward into uncharted lands, the nearest neighbor might be miles away. The nearest town, a week's ride. Days could pass without seeing another human face. And in that silence, the mind often became its own worst enemy. Imagine waking up every morning to the same empty landscape, the same biting wind, the same chores, with no one to talk to but your animals or the trees. For some, this solitude was freeing. But for many, it became suffocating. Letters from the time speak of women going mad in remote cabins, overwhelmed by the relentless quiet and the crushing workload. Men, too, would break under the weight of isolation, turning to alcohol, violence, or simply walking off into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Winters were especially cruel. When snow sealed off the homestead and darkness lasted for weeks, people were cut off from the world entirely. Cabin fever wasn't just a phrase, it was a lived experience. Some settlers reported hearing things that weren't there, voices in the wind, knocks at the door, crying in the woods. Whether it was a symptom of madness or a reflection of the mental toll, it became part of the psychological terror of being truly alone. And then there was grief. When a loved one died, a child, a spouse, a parent, there were no support systems. No counselors, no community gatherings, no funerals in the traditional sense. You might have to dig the grave yourself. You might have to sit in silence with your sorrow, with no one to help you carry it. That kind of emotional weight, day after day, could hollow a person out from the inside. Even the most hardened pioneers could find themselves undone not by war, not by hunger, but by the emptiness, the total absence of connection, comfort, or conversation. Some turned to religion or prayer. Others kept journals, writing to imagined readers just to feel heard. Still others gave up altogether, sitting on porches staring into the distance for hours, days, weeks. Their bodies remained, but their spirits faded away. Isolation also bred fear. With no one nearby, every unfamiliar sound became a threat. A knock at the door after dark could be a traveler or something worse. A rustling in the woods could be an animal or a raider. You never knew, and you had no one to turn to. Anxiety festered in the quiet, and the sense of constant vulnerability never really left. Even children weren't spared. Some grew up with no playmates outside their siblings, no formal education, no concept of life beyond their patch of land. Their worlds were small, their social skills stunted, their sense of possibility narrowed by solitude. When families did make it to towns or gatherings, many children were overwhelmed by crowds, unsure how to behave, unsure of how to belong. In the end, the frontier didn't need bullets or beasts to kill. Sometimes, all it took was silence. The kind of silence that echoed too loud, stretched too long, and slowly eroded the soul of anyone who faced it unprepared.